Quorum's present.
Quorum's present, yes, sir.
Mademoiselle, you ready? Ladies and gentlemen, a quorum is present. I call the hearing of the Readiness Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee to order. This morning we meet to mark up H.R. 5515, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019, the first subcommittee to do so. It's appropriate that the Readiness Subcommittee take the first official legislative action on this year's National Defense Authorization Act because readiness is the foundation of our national defense. Each member of the subcommittee is greatly appreciated, and your participation with the professional staff has been just vital for providing for the success of our military. The mark builds on the return of prudent funding begun with the Omnibus Appropriations Act and will continue to improve readiness across military services. I'd like to mention a few highlights. This mark would recommend the full committee increase funding for equipment, maintenance, spare parts, and training to rebuild readiness for ships, aircraft squadrons, and ground combat units. Recommend the full committee fund 20 combat training center rotations across the Army, 16 active and 4 Army National Guard. In response to years of underfunding and facility sustainment accounts, recommend that the full committee increase funds for facility sustainment for the fiscal year 2019 request. Recommend several innovative legislative initiatives that will accelerate infrastructure recovery to include a new Defense Community Infrastructure Program, which will provide for resilient facilities and utilities that off-base directly support our military installations and increase flexibility in funding for construction projects that deliver force protection and safety. Authorize the Secretary of the Military Departments to carry out military construction projects to enhance force protection and safety on military installations. Direct the Navy to provide a clear chain of command for operations, for building readiness, and for shipyard maintenance. And finally, direct changes to Navy Board of Inspection and Survey to increase the burden of inspections on crews, to ease the burden of inspections on crews and limits the time a warship may be forward deployed, as we saw with Fitzgerald and McCain. Even as we recommend higher funding in several areas, we recognize that we are still in early stages of readiness recovery. While we are pleased to fund essential readiness accounts, we will expect to see steady readiness recovery over time. The American people deserve no less for our military and military families. And I now turn to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Congresswoman Madeline Bordallo of the beautiful territory of Guam.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, let me begin by saying that I've appreciated the opportunity to work with you, Mr. Chairman, and your staff in developing this mark. This subcommittee is tasked with ensuring that the Department of Defense has the authorities and resources that they need to properly train, equip, and sustain our military forces. This year, we heard from the Department of Defense and each of the military departments on their plans for and challenges to readiness recovery. This mark seeks to support their readiness recovery efforts and ensures that all forces are prepared to respond to the full spectrum of challenges that face our national security. In particular, this subcommittee has been focused on the readiness of the surface Navy following the 4 incidents that occurred in the Pacific last year. We have closely followed the Navy's comprehensive review and strategic readiness review, but believe that additional steps are indeed necessary. To that end, the mark seeks to limit the amount of time that a Navy vessel is forward deployed overseas to no more than 10 years, clarifies command relationships, and addresses Navy inspections and crew certifications. It is my hope that this subcommittee can continue to work with the Navy's civilian and the Navy's military leadership to improve Navy readiness. Our mark requires a number of reports on key readiness issues, such as aviation parts and spares, foreign language readiness, and the use of virtual and simulated training systems and capabilities. In an effort to measure progress and assess readiness over time, the MARC also requires that GAO to assess the readiness of the armed forces in the warfighting domains of ground, sea, air, space, and cyber annually through 2022. In terms of facilities and infrastructure, we must ensure that military installations are properly postured to support the military's readiness recovery. And to that end, the MARC includes several provisions aimed at supporting the resiliency, force protection, and research and development infrastructure requirements of the department. So I want to specifically highlight one provision that would establish a new grant program for the Secretary of Defense to assist state and local governments in addressing deficiencies in community infrastructure or facilities which are located off base, but which support the operations and the resiliency of our military installations. And I would also like to highlight a couple issues addressed to the MARC that are important to Guam. First, in furtherance of the Navy's net negative commitment to the people of Guam, the MARC contains a provision that will improve transparency and establish a publicly accessible list of Navy-administered property on Guam that the Navy expects to be transferred to the government of Guam. The provision would also establish a formal process for the governor of Guam to petition the Secretary of the Navy to add specific parcels of land to this inventory. It is important for the Navy to put actions to words and show the people of Guam which properties are being returned and when the return can be expected. In addition, I am pleased the MARC includes two key provisions that would support the ship repair industry on Guam and in the U.S. Specifically, the MARC would require that Navy vessels without a home port be treated as if they were home ported in the United States or on Guam. This will ensure that the scheduled maintenance of such ships is performed as intended at shipyards in the United States or Guam, rather than in foreign shipyards. In addition, the MARC would prohibit the Navy from redeveloping the former ship repair facility on Guam for any purpose other than to support depot-level ship maintenance to include the mooring of a floating dry dock, and this committee continues to believe it is vitally important for the Navy to maintain a depot-level ship repair capability in the Western Pacific. I'd like to close by extending my gratitude to my friend and my chairman, Joe Wilson, and his staff, and my staff, and for preparing this MARC that is before the members today. And I would especially like to thank our committee staff for their many, many hours of work. To Brian Garrett, Brian Gear, Tom Howley, Jack Schuler, Margaret Dean, Drew Warren, Andy Schulman, Megan Handel, and my MLA, Ed Yanger, and my defense fellow, Major Brandon Wolf Wessling. To each of you, I want to say, as we say in Guam, si jus ma'asi, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Madeline Badayo. We now proceed to mark up H.R. 5515, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2019. Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Copies of the subcommittee mark and directive report language were made available and distributed to member offices on Tuesday, April the 24th. Is there any discussion or questions on the subcommittee mark? If there are no further discussion, the chair lays before the members the text of the subcommittee mark for consideration. Without objection, the mark is open to amendment at any time. I recognize Congressman Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the members of the subcommittee who were present yesterday and listened to my description of my en bloc, or the amendment that I was hoping to be part of the en bloc amendments. I am going to withdraw the amendment at this time, but let me take this opportunity to just say a word or two. As I mentioned yesterday, it's a pretty exciting moment when you get your constituents in alignment with the service component, in this case the Navy, and even the sub-agencies involved, in this case the Naval Academy, to reach an agreement on something. And we were able to do that. This is a constituent in perhaps the most rural portion of my district, underserved by recreational facilities, and the amendment that I hope to bring back at the full committee will address that. I ask the members to keep an open mind and to also consider, you know, the many times that we as members bring amendments or issues to the full committee that are unique or particular to our districts, particularly when they don't have our overarching national security implications, when they don't degrade the operations or the administration of a service component, nor do they impact the industrial base. I think we generally expect that our colleagues would support us in that effort. But since there continues to be a concern, and in the full spirit of bipartisan collegial cooperation, I'm going to withdraw the amendment, Mr. Chairman, and bring it back at the full committee in early May. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Congressman Anthony Brown, and we appreciate your conscientiousness on behalf of your constituents. We now consider log number 2 by Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii. For what purpose does the gentlewoman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Will the clerk please pass out the amendment? Without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed with. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman for 5 minutes for the purpose of explaining the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment seeks to eliminate language in the MARC that would require the Secretary of the Navy to designate a single commander within the Department of the Navy responsible for ensuring Navy forces are available for tasking and deployment, including those Navy forces that may be operating from a forward deployed location. This language also specifies that the Secretary of Defense may define command and control relationships within the Department of Defense. I'm concerned with the language in the MARC and how it could negatively impact the speed, flexibility, and agility of our forces operating in the Indo-Pacific region and under PACOM's command and their ability to respond to a very active region. The language offered in the Readiness MARC would essentially chip away at the existing force structure, resources, and authorities in the Pacific, and would undo a command and control relationship in the Pacific that's existed and worked for more than a decade. The current status preserves the ability of the commander of the Pacific Fleet to man, train, and equip PACOM-assigned naval forces, including the maintenance, steaming days, and flying hours required to ensure operational availability. This command and control structure allows the U.S. PACOM commander to leverage forces under his command to respond with speed and agility in resolving crisis, deterring potential adversaries, and assuring allies and partners in the region of our commitment and resolve. It is this structure that provides the framework for our national defense strategy. The language currently in the Readiness MARC could lead to situations where the PACOM commander would have to ask for forces using the request for forces model, which could be slower, more cumbersome, and less agile than the current organization. The reason this is so consequential and why we're concerned about the impact on PACOM is PACOM covers 54% of the Earth's surface, the Pacific Maritime Theater being far different than any other on the globe. Covers more area than any other geographic combatant command combined and shares borders with each of them. The tyranny of distance is a big deal. This undermines our ability to be agile, and the PACOM commander cannot afford to be saddled with additional constraints. In addition, 60% of the Navy's fleet is located in the Pacific. Who better than the Pacific Fleet commander to make informed decisions on the operational availability necessary and the activities required of the Pacific Naval Forces than the PACOM commander? Who better knows how to leverage those forces an informed commander residing in the AOR, or one literally residing half a world away in Norfolk, Virginia, with a 6-hour time difference. Earlier this month, the commander of U.S. Fleet Forces Command reiterated on the record that he, quote, would not support any changes to command and control of naval forces in the Pacific that would limit the speed, flexibility, and agility of a response or place into question U.S. resolve and commitment in the Indo-Pacific, end of quote. There's not been any conclusive studies that have determined that a single command would lend advantages to PACOM or implementing the National Defense Strategy. The Center for Naval Analysis, in a Navy-sponsored study in September of last year, recommended no changes to the current force structure because there was no understanding as to whether or not a single resource provider would help or hurt the Navy's readiness. Further, the Strategic Readiness Review rejected the Comprehensive Review's recommendation to establish a single Echelon 2 higher headquarters responsible for the readiness generation of all Navy forces. Mr. Chairman, current statute already allows the Navy to reorganize if it notifies appropriators and they do not object within 30 days. It is my belief that we don't need additional congressional action on this issue, at least not until a study has been conducted on the effects that it would have. Mr. Chairman, given the national security environment, I would ask your consideration that we not seek drastic changes in the current PACOM readiness structure. I'll withdraw this amendment at this time, Mr. Chairman, and seek your commitment to working with the Hawaii delegation and our colleagues to find common ground on this issue as we move forward in the coming weeks towards the full committee mark. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard of California. Thank you for offering and withdrawing.
Hawaii, from Hawaii, farther out, past California.
Oh, hey, thank goodness. Anyway, and we all know that Hawaii is a copy of Guam. But continuing, I'd like to thank you, and we do look forward to working together with you on this, and appreciate, again, your working so well for your constituents. And now we proceed back again for consider log number 3, Congressman Anthony Brown of Maryland. And for what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, to offer an amendment which, again, I described yesterday in brief, 800-plus acres, property owned by the Navy.
Congressman Brown, will the clerk please pass out the amendment?
Oh, okay. I apologize.
And without objection, the reading of the amendment will be dispensed. The chair recognizes Congressman Brown for 5 minutes.
Okay.
For the purpose.
I got to brush it up on process.
No, and for purpose of further explaining the amendment.
Yes. 800-plus acres. It's been sitting idle for decades. It was once on the BRAC excess list. This amendment basically is report language that instructs that the Navy evaluate, assess the property, and come back with recommendations on disposition. It is not a substitute for my earlier amendment. This is for the full 800 acres. I still will come back asking for a conveyance of 30 acres at full committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you very much, Congressman Brown. Is there any further discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, if not, the question is now on the adoption of the amendment offered by Mr. Brown. For so many who are in favor, they shall say aye. 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 Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there any additional amendments to the subcommittee mark? The question now occurs on the adoption of the mark. So many as are in favor will say aye. 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 Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the mark is adopted. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Arizona, Congresswoman Martha McSally, for the purpose of a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the subcommittee report the mark as amended favorably to the full committee.
The question is now on the motion of the gentlewoman from Arizona, Congresswoman Martha McSally. So many are in favor will say aye. 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 Those opposed, no. A quorum being present, the ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. And without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, members have 5 legislative days within which to submit written statements into the record. So ordered. I ask unanimous consent that staff be authorized to make necessary conforming technical and clerical changes and to remove from the mark, as amended, provisions that would cause the mark to refer to other committees or would result in additional direct spending or would result in an earmark. Without objection, is so ordered. There being no further legislative business before the subcommittee, this meeting is adjourned. Wow. Thanks, sir. No, you did good. I know.